Hi, my name is Ken Kilbride and I'm the Chief Executive of ADHD Ireland. And I particularly would like to thank Wexford County Council for giving me the opportunity to do a talk today with you on what is ADHD. So for the next half an hour or so, just sit back, relaxed. We're going to give you a full information talk on what is ADHD, what it isn't, and how you identify the signs, and how you do the treatment. So just going to do a little slideshow with this as well to help you get some more information. So in terms of ADHD, ADHD affects about 5% of the population. So on that, what we say is that based on the last census, ADHD would affect about 170,000 people. Of that, you were talking about 170,000 adults. And on that, we're talking about 60,000 children. ADHD also as a condition makes up the largest amount of children going through the CAM service. And most parents are familiar with the CAM service because that's where you get your children assessed. So CAM stands for the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. There is one in Wexford, and we deal with them on a regular basis. The other thing about ADHD as a condition is that, the symptoms and the presentation do go on into adulthood, and they run through adolescence as well. So just go on to the next slide. And then on to the next slide. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition, and that's recognized by something called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is a playbook written by the American Psychiatric Association. And they basically decide what is a condition and what isn't a condition. And over the last 20 years or so, they have been including ADHD. Within that, we also recognize the role of genetics. Various studies, both internationally and in Ireland, would suggest that about 70 to 90% of ADHD has a genetic component. And as a twin studies suggest up to 90% heritability. Now, the reason we suggest that is when we're talking to teachers and or parents, is that if you have a child with ADHD, there's a reasonably likelihood that one of the parents also has ADHD. And the other thing about that is they may not be diagnosed. As we were saying earlier, the prevalence of ADHD is about 3 to 5% depending on which country you're in. But again, how many children are actually diagnosed in Ireland of those 60,000 children? The answer is we simply don't know. And we've talked to all the leading academics, all the leading researchers in Ireland about the condition. And the estimate they give us that is about 30 to 50%. So that means that of the 60,000 children in Ireland with ADHD, 20 to 30,000 do have a diagnosis. But it also means, quite possibly, that maybe 30 to 40,000 don't. So when people say that ADHD is a condition in Ireland is overdiagnosed, that's simply incorrect. And one of the other things, it's most commonly diagnosed pre-adolescence. So what we mean by that is it's diagnosed usually in the ages of 8 to 12. And in that period of time, it's actually diagnosed at a rate of 4 to 1 in favor of boys versus girls. Now, we talked earlier about ADHD being a neurodevelopmental condition and having a genetic component. And on that, it means that, ADHD is 50% boys, 50% girls. So why is it that boys are diagnosed about 4 to 1 in favor of girls in that age group? And that's quite simply down to the fact that boys are the ones that tend to be bouncing off the walls. There's an old saying, girls internalize, boys externalize. So they externalize their ADHD, and that generally gets picked up by the teacher. They have a chat to the parent, and the child gets sent for assessment. But one of the things that we do always need to point out when we're talking to anyone is the fact that girls have ADHD, they have it at the same rates, but they may be showing more the inattentive ADHD than the hyperactive. And this is much needs to be picked up by anything, particularly teachers and parents, so that they can get the right treatments as well. As we were saying, the figures showed that 30 to 50% of patients progress into adolescence and parenthood as well. And the other thing that has happened recently in the DSM in the last 20 years or so is that now adults can be now diagnosed. And now we move on to the next slide. So a little bit of science. And when I started this job 3 years ago, I had to go and find the definition of the word etiology myself. So that's the causes, set our causes, or manage our causation of a disease of the condition. So of ADHD, there's abnormal dopamine signaling in the frontal cortex, and there's a deficiency of noradrenaline in the reticular activating system. You really don't need to know too much about that. Basically, what all that says is there's a lack of dopamine. And then we go on to the next slide. So one of the things about science is that it has to be replicable. So what you do in science, you come up with a theory, and you then go do your tests. You then publish it, and then scientists around the world trying to replicate it. So about 5 or 6 years ago, there's a lady called Barbara Franke, and she started doing an awful lot of work in terms of brain imaging of people with ADHD. So the slide we have here shows some brain imaging work that was actually done in the Whelan lab here in Trinity in Dublin. So what they did was they took a stimulus and they showed it to people who had ADHD, they showed it to their relatives, and they showed it to their controls. You can quite clearly see that different parts of the brain light up for the same stimulus when people have ADHD compared to people when they don't. So what does this mean? So what it means when a person of a brain with ADHD is not engaged in activity, it appears to go into a drowsy, energetic state. Now that sounds a little bit contradictory, drowsy and energetic at the same time, but it is one of the key drivers and key instincts behind what is ADHD. So what happens is the brain is not getting enough new exciting input from the environment, and it's not getting sufficiently stimulating or rewarding feelings. So what happens with the ADHD brain is it says, I'm not finding this interesting, find me something else. So a person with ADHD is looking at something, just say their maths homework if they're a child, and they're going, this really isn't engaging with me. They go looking, finding other things that have interest in them. So that's one of the first big things about ADHD. It's said that people with ADHD can't focus. That's untrue. People with ADHD can focus as much as anyone else. It's just simply the inability to retain focus is one of the key times we have ADHD. What happens is the ADHD goes and says, find me something else, this isn't interesting, find me something else, find me something else, find me something else. So it's always a case where the ADHD brain is looking to find something interesting and moving on. So it's the inability to retain focus rather than the ability to have focus is the key point here. And then we just move on. And this is probably one of the more difficult slides we have, even though while it doesn't look like it. This talks about what happens when people go untreated into adulthood and don't have ADHD. We know from lots of international research, people with ADHD have higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of marital breakdown, higher rates of car crashes. Approximately 25% of the prison population, both in Ireland and internationally, meets the criteria for an ADHD diagnosis. There's higher rates of drug and alcohol misuse. People with ADHD have basically 5 years lower life expectancy, and this is generally driven by accidents. And people with ADHD also have increased rates for anxiety, depression, and other psychiatric conditions. So what I'm saying here is that when ADHD is undiagnosed and it goes into adulthood, it can have long-lasting effects. But we always say when we're doing any talk to anybody anywhere is that when you have ADHD, the younger it can get picked up, the better the life outcomes for the person. So which is we're always interested in talking to teachers, parents, whoever it happens to be. If you can start to identify what are the characteristics of ADHD and you can pick them up, well then you can improve the outcomes for that person. And then just move on to the next slide. And then just go on to the next slide after that. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the main behaviors behind ADHD are. So the first one is that's the inattention. That's what we're talking about, the lack of focus. So when you have a child, you fail to, notice that they fail to give close attention or details, that they make careless errors in schoolwork or other activities. They have difficulty organizing tasks and activities, and they avoid and dislike those tasks that engage required sustained mental effort. So you know that when you're doing the homework with the child, they know the answer to the question. They know 10 by 10 is 100, but they write down 110. And you know when they're doing their maths homework, they forget their maths book. They know in the morning when they're going out to school, they should be bringing their PE with them because it's Wednesday. They forget things like that. So it's that inability to retain that focus, and it's those type of things, forgetful in daily activities, easy distracted by external stimuli. They're the kind of attention or lack of attention symptoms that you notice in someone that has ADHD. And the next one slide shows when we talk about hyperactivity and impulsivity. This is one of the big things and one of the big difficulties that comes with ADHD as a condition. and that's the inability to see the consequence of actions. So when you have a child with ADHD, can be very excitable, they can blurt out the answers, they have trouble taking turns, interrupt on others in hard times, and this can lead to social difficulties. And this is the big difficulty that goes with ADHD. ADHD itself is a difficult condition, but it's the social difficulties that it brings, particularly for children. As parents, you might know that the child with ADHD may not get invited to the birthday party, they don't get invited to the play days. People with ADHD or children with ADHD can be very good at making friends very quickly, but they fall out of that group very quickly as well. And it's because of this impulsivity. What we say about ADHD, people with ADHD have a brain, what they say about is Ferrari brain, bicycle brakes. And we're talking about here something called executive function. And the executive function is like the conductor in the brain. And people with ADHD don't have that conductor. So all the lights are green. And so when a thought comes into their head, they don't process it, they just say it. When they have a thought, if they're jumping onto someone, they don't think about it, they just do it. So they blurt out the answers, trouble taking turns, can be over physical. That can lead to the social difficulties, and one of the biggest difficulties that goes with ADHD, and that's the inability to see the consequence of actions. And the next slide we talk about is overactivity. And this is what we call hyperactivity. So it's high rate of activity, squirm or fidget a lot, excessive risk taking, runs around a lot, climbs excessively. This can happen in classrooms. And the basic things what you need to notice here are the child looks like they're driven by a motor. So the three main behaviors that go with ADHD, the inability to focus, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. When you get those three together, that's really what ADHD presents like. Some people say we're all a little bit ADHD. We all forget things. We're all a little bit impulsive. We're all a little bit hyperactive. And that's true. However, the thing about ADHD is it becomes a difficulty in your life. When it becomes a difficulty in your life, it then becomes ADHD. Then just have a look at the next slide. So this is just a little one just to show you what it's like. If you ever want to know what my brain is like, imagine having 239 tabs open on your computer all the time. One thing we also say when we're talking to people is just a little bit of sorry, 2 seconds. Is a little bit of an exercise just for yourself. Imagine you're not looking at the screen. Imagine looking at the wall in front of you. Imagine on that screen there's 20 televisions. And I ask you to focus on one of those screens. You start to focus on that screen. But on the bottom right corner, there's something much more interesting. Then you look at that, and there's one on the top left-hand corner that's even more interesting. I've asked you to look at one screen, but 30 seconds later, you've already looked at 3 screens. This is what ADHD is like. This is what it's like in the brain of ADHD. It's like having 20 television channels on all at the same time. ADHD as a condition is very tiring for the person that has it. And then just move on to the next slide. So we talked earlier about the behaviors of ADHD, the ability to retain focus, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So what are the types of ADHD? So there's predominantly inattentive presentation. So that's hard for an individual to organize, finish a task, pay attention, follow instructions or conversations, and the person is easily distracted or forgets the details in daily routines. You could have 100% inattentive presentation, have absolutely no hyperactivity whatsoever, and have ADHD. Then there's the predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation. So that's the person fidgets, talks a lot, and finds it difficult to sit still, feels restless, has trouble with impulsivity, and they're so impulsive that they interrupt each other, grab things from other people, speaks at inappropriate times, and it's hard for the person to take their turns and listen to the directions. So that's an example of what the impulsive or hyperactive presentation can be like. You could have 100% hyperactive impulsive presentation, absolutely no difficulty with focus whatsoever, and have ADHD. However, the combined presentation is the most common. And most people have this, so they have an equal mix of the inattentive and the hyperactive. So that's what you see more often than anything else. But an interesting point to observe is that the symptoms do change over time. So a child that you see at the age of 6 is not how you see them at 16, and it's not how they will be at 26. So you need to bear in mind that the symptoms of ADHD change over time. Then just move on. The other characteristics that also go with the condition, as we talked about earlier, particularly with the impulsivity, there's the poor internalization of social rules, interpersonal adjustment problems. There can be an emotional maturity delay, and this is one that doesn't get talked about enough. What we're talking about here is that people with ADHD have an emotional maturity delay, particularly as children, of about 25%. So if you have a child that's 12, they will have the emotional maturity of a 9-year-old. If you have a child that's 8, they will have the emotional maturity of a 6-year-old. So when you put these together with the impulsivity and the hyperactivity, children with ADHD can seem emotionally immature, and particularly when they're in the classroom setting. And this is one of the things that we need to talk to teachers about an awful lot. Yes, you may have an 8-year-old child in your class, but they have an emotional maturity of a 6-year-old, so you need to approach them and work with them as someone who has an emotional maturity of a 6-year-old. That's why they're appearing childish or whatever happens to be for that. And the big difficulty with ADHD is when you put all these things together, the person with ADHD can look to be emotionally difficult, and they can have self-esteem. Self-esteem is the biggest difficulty that goes with ADHD as a condition. And any work that we can do as an organisation to reduce that stigma that goes with ADHD and reduce that self-esteem is something that we ask either parents or teachers or medical professionals to do. Then let's move on. We talked earlier about comorbidity, and comorbidity is a terrible word. We really don't like it. We much prefer the term coexisting. So what are the other conditions that exist with ADHD? So we're talking here about the other neurodevelopmental conditions. So we're talking about things like 70% of children will have one other condition, 32 will have 2 other conditions, and 11% will have 3 other conditions. So what are we talking about here? Dyspraxia is very common. Dyslexia is very common. Asperger's condition, Tourette's, ODD, and OCD. These are conditions that are very, very common with ADHD. This is one of the reasons we all say it's always very important to get the diagnosis, particularly the younger you can get it for a child with ADHD, because of these existing conditions. Also, that ADHD itself exists on a spectrum, so you can have it mild, moderate, or severe. So when you go to get the assessment, you can find out if your child has mild ADHD with dyslexia, or moderate ADHD with Asperger's, or severe ADHD with dyslexia, or maybe 2 or 3 conditions. Once you get this information, it's then possible to put in the right treatment plan, because how you treat a child with ADHD and dyslexia is not the same how you treat a child with ADHD and Asperger's, or how you help them in an educational setting. So it's very, very important to get this information, to get the child into the system, to get that diagnosis. Because as I was saying earlier, this is one of the big things about ADHD. Once you get into the system and get the right assessment, outcomes improve for children with ADHD across their lifespan. And this is probably one of the best things that you can do for them. So just move on there. Other things about associated school problems, language impairment problems. Children with ADHD don't necessarily have a language problem itself. It's more of an information processing thing. We talked about there the ability to retain information. So when a teacher's talking to a child and they've said, I want you to do point A, point B, point C, and point D, the child with ADHD has already forgotten points A and B. Their mind has moved on. They've lost focus on that. They thought C and D were much more interesting, and that's where the focus is. It's not that the child being willful or bad. It's just they have a difficulty with information processing. And there can be difficulty with learning disabilities. As you mentioned earlier, there's the lower self-esteem. There can be the poor self-skills. And when you put all those together, they can be things that determine why the child in school can have problems. And we just move on there. But we talked about the problems, but there also is the good sides that go to ADHD. Something like creativity. And we talked about that Ferrari brain area. And the ability to move through ideas. Creativity is once described as the ability to go through 999 solutions very quickly to find the 1,000. People with ADHD are very good at that. They can go through those 1,000 solutions and come up with the right one. So people with ADHD can be creative. They can be very imaginative. They can be open-minded, determined, passionate. These are all strengths that go with the condition that don't get mentioned as much as the challenges. But there is an awful lot there that can work with ADHD. Then just the next one, please. So again, when you have these characteristics, can they be of benefit to a person and in an organization as they go into the workplace? Indeed, they can. So we talked about, the creativity, that ability to run through lots of solutions to find the right one. Multitasking. That's one of the other things that people with ADHD are good at. Because of that Ferrari brain, they can jump from one item to another, to another, to another. So people like journalists who work on 10, 15 items a day. People with ADHD are good at that. We then talked about risk-taking, and we talked about that impulsivity that goes with ADHD. So while the rest of us are actually forming a committee to look at an idea, the person with ADHD has just gone out and done it. We then talked about the high energy that goes with the condition and that hyperactivity. So when you take that ability to be very creative, that ability to take risks, and that high energy and drive that goes with the condition, when you have all those together and you can work with them very properly, you find you have someone that's very important to an organization. And it's also said, and Forbes magazines would say this on a regular basis, that ADHD is the entrepreneurial gene. And we haven't done the surveys, but we have talked to lots of people about this. That if you took the 100 greatest entrepreneurs on this planet, I would bet everything that I have and everything that ADHD Ireland has, that at least 50% of them have ADHD. So it is a condition that does work for people in terms of getting extra success into the future. Then just the next slide, please. So again, just so I know where we are in terms of the COVID crisis. So as ourselves an organization, we ran a survey. And this will just give you an example of how the strengths of ADHD work. So we asked the people, 10, 11 questions about ADHD. We also said, could you tell us, how ADHD is affecting you? So someone wrote back to say, it's been an opportunity to utilize my lateral thinking, creative problem solving and neurodivergent abilities to fulfill their potential. In my organization, I've been to the forefront of coming up with several creative solutions to keep our work going. I've seen opportunities and solutions others have missed, and I've had the energy and momentum to implement them quickly while others appear to flounder. It has given me the opportunity to let the best of my ADHD flourishes to the benefit of my team and my organization. As a result, my ideas have contributed significantly to retaining dozens of people where I work, where they otherwise may have been laid off. So that just shows you when you have ADHD working and you can get it pointed in the right direction, how you can achieve great things for the person and for other people as well. I'll just move on there. So again, we're talking about, famous people with ADHD. We talk about entrepreneurs. We're talking about people like Richard Branson, the guy who founded IKEA, the guy who founded the JetBlue, Jamie Oliver, lots of sport people, Michael Phelps, Simone Biles, Michael Jordan, Greg LeMond. Michael Phelps is probably something you've probably heard about him before, that he has ADHD. Michael Phelps holds the world record for gold medals at the Olympics of 23. Michael Phelps also has ADHD. I'm not saying at the age of 10 or 11 his parents threw him in the swimming pool, but with all that hyperactivity, they put him in the swimming pool. He went up and down and up and down and up and down. 15 years later, 23 gold medals. So he was able to use it very significantly to help him in his success. And the last on the list there is Greg LeMond, and he's also in the top right-hand corner there. Greg LeMond won the Tour de France twice. Greg LeMond won the Tour de France twice in the years that Lance Armstrong didn't with him. We know what Armstrong was on when he won it. Greg Armstrong just used his ADHD. He used that hyperactivity and impulsivity to get him over the hills that others didn't. So ADHD has been used by lots of people to create other success. And just moving on to the next slide, ADHD is very, very prevalent, and it's one of the key determinants, particularly in the creative industries. So who we talk about famous people with ADHD? Who are the entertainers? Will Smith. If anybody's ever seen Jim Carrey in a film, you know who we're talking about. Ryan Gosling, Woody Harrelson, the two Justins, Timberlake, Justin Bieber, Cara Delevingne, Michelle Rodriguez, Well I Am, and you might remember last year, Ant McPartlin from Ant and Dec. I could possibly put up 2 or 3 more slides of famous people with ADHD. There's lots of lists of them out there on the internet. There are people that you know who've been able to use their condition of ADHD, using that creativity, that impulsivity, and that hyperactivity to help them be successful over a long period of time. And just moving on. So a little bit about the treatment of ADHD. There's 2 main treatments. Pharmacological, that's basically medication. Psychosocial, that's the behavioral side. And there's also parental training, which is one of the important things that we always recommend and all the research recommends. One of the most important interventions, particularly when you have a child who's just been diagnosed with ADHD, is for the parent to get some parental training. There is social skills training, and there's ADHD coaching. Just the next slide. So one of the things we do get asked often and regularly is about ADHD medication. And a lot of parents we know are reluctant to put their child on it, but research does show it's effective, and it can allow other treatments to work in other situations where they might not work, and it helps the child's behavior work to a level where other influences will work. We talked about earlier about the lack of dopamine. So simply what the medication does is it stops the dopamine from falling out of the synapses in the brain. So it's a very simple medication. Research shows that over the last 50 years, when it works, it really, really works. Research says that medication works in about 80% of cases. We know from talking to people, certainly 50%. But those 50% will say it's life-changing. It's the best thing that they ever did. It's like putting on glasses for the first time. Again, just go on to the next one. The other thing, particularly psychologists would say is, pills don't build skills. And that's true. Medication, as we're saying, does help other things work. But what are those other good things that do help work? And that's the behavioral side of ADHD. And certainly all the international research will show that what's called as a multimodal approach is the best way to treat ADHD. So ADHD multimodal treatment is a combination of medication and behavioral therapy. So what you're talking about in behavioral therapy is create a routine. So do the same things every day. Get organized. Have everything organized in the morning. So you have a chart and a routine to get out of the house. Avoid distractions. Turn off the television. Limit choices. People with ADHD, as we were talking earlier, we have that inability to process language. So don't give, 4 choices. Keep it A or B. Change the interaction style. Keep it simple. Use goals and rewards. This is one of the things we talk about a lot when we're doing, talks with parents and schools. There's lots of books written on goals and awards, lots of big books written on goals and awards. We would say it's called bribery. Find out what your child likes. Use that as a means to get them to do things. So simple things like, if you finish your maths homework, you can have an hour on the PlayStation. If you tidy up your bedroom, you can have your GAA on Saturday. So find out what's meaningful to them and use it as a goal and award. And as we would always say, discipline effectively, and that needs to be consistent both across the parents and the school. And just move on. So that's a little bit about that. ADHD Ireland ourselves, we were founded in 1980. Our mission in life is simply to make life better for people with ADHD. And we work with parents, carers, siblings, relatives, teachers, staff, community organisations, professionals, and mostly important, those with ADHD, both adults and children. Just the next slide. As I say, what we do is we are a source of information around ADHD for parents, professionals, and groups. We run parenting courses. We currently have some parenting courses running in Wexford. We do other courses. We do online courses. We do lending libraries. And we do an awful lot of awareness talks. We go out talk to schools, community organisations, companies. We're always open to suggestions. Recently, we started doing mindfulness classes. And we've also done yoga classes for adults. We do socials. We do lots of things like that. So if you have any suggestions about what we can do, we'll always love to hear from you on that. And just move on to the next one. As I say, we do socials. We talked about earlier about social difficulties being probably one of the biggest drivers behind ADHD. So in the last couple of years, we started running socials. So the picture you see there is from last summer. We did a teddy bear picnic in the Phoenix Park. And so 10 families came along. They brought their children. Some of the children went off to the playground. Other parents sat down, had a cup of coffee. Everybody had a great day on. And just the next one we're going to show you is something called the Mini Muckers. Mini Muckers is, if you ever watch Fittest Family on the television, they go through these 2 kilometers of mud and water. So this was one done in Punchestown last year. We brought 25 families along. They all went out. They had a great day. And so we're doing lots of those now to help families get out and about and have a meaningful day out. Just move on to the next one. So how do you get in contact with us? We get a couple of thousand calls a year on the phone. So give us a call about any ADHD questions on 874-8349. And drop us an email to info@adhdireland.ie. We have our new website, which is adhdireland.ie. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. We're based in the Carmichael Centre, which is in Dublin 1. I appreciate it may be a bit difficult for people to work, but if we do get people, just drop in, sit down, have a cup of coffee. We're more than welcome to do that. And that's sort of more the formal part of the presentation. But one of the good things Wexford Libraries did do in putting this together was they put out some questions and feelers to people and said, would you have any questions? And see if we can get them answered. So just, have a look at the first one. The first question is, I would like to ask how we can identify correctly if a child is displaying signs of ADHD, or if a child is just a little bit more highly strung, active, and sometimes more curious than their children, which can often lead to the child demonstrating signs of ADHD. Great question. As we were saying earlier, we all demonstrate signs of ADHD. But one of the things you find, just particularly about when we talked about CAMS earlier, when they're doing children with ADHD, is they don't do them before the age of 6. You probably heard the thing about the terrible twos, and they need to be able to be sure that it's just not the terrible twos going on. And again, one of the things they do want to do is they have the child at a particular age where they're able to interact with the thing themselves and input themselves into their own diagnosis. So yes, you do need the child to have a particular level of maturity, and you do need to be able to work them so you can check it out. But as we were saying earlier, it's only if it becomes a difficulty in their lives is it ADHD, and that's where you need to draw the line to see if you get the assessment or not. The other question was from a teacher. I've had a child in my school is approximately 10-year-old. I thought he showed obvious signs of ADHD. However, the parents said no, he didn't. And he asked other teachers and they didn't see what I saw. However, the parents did agree about everything I saw and they brought him to be assessed and he was diagnosed with ADHD. So could it be a case that the traits of ADHD were not obvious the years before, or has he missed out on an early diagnosis? What we do find is, particularly with boys, is the hyperactivity can get more pronounced. And when the teacher starts to see that, then it becomes ADHD. Then you see the child bouncing off the wall. So it's important to see, as we were saying earlier, that the symptoms can change over time. And probably not much over 2 or 3 years in terms of just the first 2 or 3 years of school. But once you get that child past 6 and get them into that pre-progressive stage, when you get the major mental diagnosis, then the symptoms can be more pronounced. But at that stage, you need to start watching out for the inattentive ones as much as the ones for hyperactivity. Here's an interesting question, and this is something that comes up an awful lot, particularly when parents phone us. Can a child with ADHD behave in school with no problems? But when they come home, it's like a switch goes off and they are wired. So yes is the answer. One of the big things that goes with ADHD is the anxiety behind the condition. And children with ADHD know they have the condition, whether they've been diagnosed or not. They can see that they have those social difficulties. So they suppress it. When we're talking about girls, to internalize it, particularly, so they don't show it. And we talked about when we're talking about those 20 screens on the wall, and it's the anxiety. That anxiety is tiring. That anxiety takes an awful lot out of a child. So you will find that when the child keeps it together all day, they come home and everything unwinds. Then you find the other thing is that particularly with medication, particularly when they first start on it, a medication, particularly when on stimulant medication like Ritalin, it lasts 8 hours. They take it at 8 o'clock in the morning. They have all this anxiety all day. Medication lasts 8 hours, wears off 4 o'clock in the afternoon, precisely when they started doing the homework, precisely when they got home from school. So yeah, very common for a child to be able to keep it together in school, and then all hell breaks loose when they come home. The other question is for children who are having school refusing and difficulties in school before the lockdown. What will be available during the lockdown and afterwards? We've talked, we're not entirely sure about this. There was going to be changes to the SNA allocations. These have now all been put on hold. So we simply don't know the answer in terms of extra allocations for children with ADHD just at the moment. What resources would benefit a child with ADHD? Are there any services that a parent could access privately that it might help the child? We talked about it in terms of the behavioural things that you can get through CAMS because they do the multimodal treatments. And so they will have the speech therapist, they will have the play therapist, they will have the behavioural therapist there as well. But one thing that we'd always recommend for people with ADHD particularly is OT. OT is great for children and for adults. OT is, the ability to put that structure in, to put that plan in that works for people. So if you can get a private OT or get an OT through the public system, OT is great. Is medication always necessary for ADHD is another question from a parent. We talked about earlier about ADHD being on a spectrum of mild, moderate, or severe. So approximately, 1/3 will be moderate, 1/3 will be severe, and 1/3 will be mild. If you have a child that has ADHD, if they're mild, probably won't require medication. If they're moderate or severe, they may require medication. So this is why we always say that it's very important to get the assessment, to find out what the coexisting conditions are, and to find out what type of ADHD it is. So once you get that, you might see if medication is required or not. And that's something you need to talk about when you talk to psychiatrists, either in CAMS or privately. So again, that's basically all the questions we received from that. So I'd like to thank you all for watching this video. I'd like to thank Wexford Libraries for giving us the opportunity to put together. As you're saying, if you have any questions at any time, drop us a line to info@ADHD Ireland or visit us online at ADHD Ireland, or give us a call on 01 874 8349. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.